Okay, I like to get started now. My name and good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Donna Reiner. I happen to be the Secretary Treasurer of the Arizona Preservation Foundation, which is one of the co-presenters here. This series started a number of years ago. Seems like much longer than it really was, but when during COVID, the state SHPO and Arizona Preservation, we couldn't have our state conference. And so we started having preservation in place. And since then, we've tried to present a number of webinars. They're not necessarily every month, but we do record them, and they are on the Arizona Preservation, and it's azpreservation.org. You can find the recordings so that you can see this again, or you can see some of the ones we have previously had. For those of you, what we do request is that you stay on mute, and when we're going to have a Q&A at the end, you can, during the course of this talk, go on chat and place your questions, and we'll ask those at the end of the session. It may inspire some other questions. You'll have the opportunity then to raise your hand, and we will call on you. And for those of you, I do have hearing issues, and so I use closed captions at the bottom. You can see the box with a CC, and you can click on that so that you can see what is being said, as much as the closed captions are accurate. And with that, I can't remember. Rebecca, you must have sent me something that I was going to read and talk about you. And now all of a sudden, I'm not sure where I put that. So if you don't mind introducing yourself, I will let you do it. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Donna. Yeah, I have a slide in here that kind of a little about me. And I just wanted to say thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting us to talk about this project that we worked on. And I also want to thank my colleagues who helped work on this project. I'm really happy to be here to discuss the multiple property documentation forum that we did for Nebraska's Women in Trades. It was a really challenging project, and hopeful it serves as inspiration for others to take on similar studies in their communities. So a little bit about me. I'm the senior architectural historian at Post Oak Preservation Solutions. I'm based in Austin, Texas, but have worked across the country and across Texas, and in Nebraska for this project. I've been since around 2008, and have a particular interest in documenting underrepresented communities and resources, including vernacular resources, and really interested in community-centered historic preservation. So can I give you an overview? I'm going to talk about the project and kind of what led to its initiation, our kind of overarching approach as we headed into it, some of the early challenges we faced, kind of outline the structure of the MPDF, and then go through the historic contexts and share with you some of the really cool stories that we uncovered during our research. And then talk specifically about the Laura B. Wood and Alta Ward Historic District and the properties associated with them that is going to be listed under the MPDF, and then some of the lessons learned throughout the process. So this project was initiated when the City of Lincoln received an Underrepresented Communities grant from the National Park Service. These grants, the goal of these grants was to diversify listings submitted to the National Register of Historic Places, and the grants must result in the submission of a new or amended nomination to the National Register of Historic Places. So the project was based on feedback from the National Park Service on a nomination that was submitted by the City of Lincoln in 2022 for properties associated with Laura B. Wood and her daughter Alta Ward. They were real estate developers in the 1930s and 1940s in Lincoln, Nebraska. So this project was intended to kind of build on the city's previous efforts in documenting her properties. So just a little bit of the kind of why, underrepresented communities and women in the National Register. It's a kind of old study, but I didn't find anything newer that looked into this. But a 1997 study found that at that time, of the almost 10,000 properties listed on the National Register associated with significant persons, only 3% were associated with women. The study also found that of the 25,000 names associated with builders and architects in the database, only around 90 were women. In 2022, the National Trust conducted another study of historic sites, largely those owned or operated by the National Park Service, and found that only 18% of NPS historic sites were explicitly associated with women and less than 4% of National Historic Landmarks. So this lack of representation of women in the National Register and other, local and other kinds of historic designations really underscores the necessity of documenting and celebrating the roles that women have played in paving or in American placemaking. And so this effort was intended to kind of expand upon our understanding of women's roles in the built environment. So I'm going to kind of outline how we conceived and how we thought about the NPDF as we were going into it. So really, we wanted to create an inclusive document that outlined women's contributions to the built environment in Nebraska, spanning different historical eras and property types, and really looking at the intersections of race, gender identity, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and culture. And we really wanted to create something that was open-ended and left room for listing properties that may be identified in the future and for expanding this context as new research is uncovered. So part of, one thing I want to note is that a statewide survey of resources associated with women in the trades was not part of the scope of this project. So because of that, we don't know for certain how many properties are out there, if they are extant, if they retain integrity, if they rise to the level of significance. But what we did try to do was show the very different ways and that women participated in shaping the built environment, and hopefully that will spur further studies in the future. We did conduct a survey of properties associated with Laura B. Wood, which was the specific scope of this project. So another kind of guiding principle we had on women in the building trades, and I'll kind of get into the why of this, but because women were often working in a more informal way or outside kind of traditional professional boundaries, we had to determine a broad understanding of what we meant by women in the building trades and what types of properties we were going to consider. So we tried to make the definitions usable, but also flexible. So our kind of overarching guidance or thesis statement was that the guiding principle was that women in the building trades included women or a woman who directly shaped the built environment of the state. So I'm going to kind of go over some of the initial challenges into starting the research of this project. So first, there's a lot of minimization or erasure of women's labor contributions in the historic record. And then there's a lack of pre-existing scholarship in this very specific area of study, particularly the women in the building trades in Nebraska. There's some good research and some good information about women in the building trades along the East Coast, in areas like Chicago, along the West Coast, in places like San Francisco. But in kind of the Western region, there wasn't a ton of information, and this is kind of a new field to be researching. And then we find existing prejudice and bias within the historic scholarship. So a lot of, women's labor was labeled as hobbies or fads. Now, this one came up a lot during our research, and this is the use of surnames or initials or masculine coded language to disguise women's roles. So many women themselves would just use their initials, or they would often be referred to by their husband's name, Mrs. So-and-so. And that is something that we came across very often in our research. And then a lot of women were reticent to highlight or draw attention to their work. And then the other, women in the trades were more likely to work in the domestic sphere on gardens, residences, or small-scale building projects that garnered less prestige, were less likely to be written up in the newspaper or other sorts of public sources like that. So it took a little bit more digging to kind of find out what women were doing during various time periods. And then we had some limitations related to the grant itself and some, let's see. So we only had one comparable MPDF to kind of use as a go by, and it's a great one, the Women in Maryland Architecture MPDF. And, you know, it was very well written. I highly recommend you look at it. It's a great go by. But that was focused on one specific trade, architecture. And there was a lot more documentation material about what women were doing in Maryland compared to what we found in Nebraska. The other limitation that we had was just the time frame of the grant program and the project itself. And because this is an underdocumented field of study, it was a bit of a struggle. So basically we had, I'll show you this, 6 months from kickoff to conduct research, site visit to conduct survey of Laura B. Wood properties, to do outreach, and draft and organize the narrative. So while this is, when you're looking at it at a big scale, it's a multi-year project, the actual amount of time available for research writing and survey and all of that really boils down to about 6 months. And so that can create some challenges. So our research methodology, we cast a very wide net, trying to gain both a broad understanding of the history of Nebraska, the specific circumstances of women in Nebraska, and then the unique circumstances of women in the trades in a variety of social, economic, cultural, and demographic contexts. So we kind of looked at a lot of the typical sources we would look at if we were writing a National Register nomination about something else. So we looked at existing National Register nominations and MPDFs to kind of get a sense of how they were formatted. We looked at scholarly journals, architecture and trade magazines, newspapers, census records and city directories, kind of broad histories of Nebraska, broad women's history, history of architecture and trades in Nebraska, history of women in architecture and trades throughout the country, previous surveys. And then we really found some good information on online forums, Reddit, Facebook, groups of people working in the trades now, that helped kind of flesh out our information. We also reached out to dozens of local, state, and national organizations to see if anyone knew of specific women in the building trades, either nationally or in Nebraska, or could direct us to resources that would assist our research. And, we did hear back from a number of folks, mostly historical societies throughout Nebraska, and they offered what information that they did have. Many were really excited to hear about the work we were doing and hopeful that we would, find some great stories. And then we also spoke with a group of historians and other folks led by Chris Morris, the National Trust, who are doing some really great pioneering projects in women's history. And they gave us some good feedback and some good things to think about and some resources to look into. So now I'm going to kind of walk you through how we structured the NPDF. And I will caveat this with the fact that we experimented with several different ways of presenting the information and reorganizing it, and this is where we landed. So initially we proposed kind of an open-ended period of significance, really to encompass the fact that Indigenous communities have inhabited present-day Nebraska for millennia, and really kind of wanted to get some preliminary feedback from both SHPO and NPS on when, an appropriate start date, particularly what would be. And because little is known about the gender dynamics of these early Indigenous peoples in present-day Nebraska prior to settler colonization of the state, the earliest kind of documentation, written documentation that we have begins to come in the 1840s following the Preemption Act and immigration into Nebraska. So because of that, we settled on a period of significance that begins circa 1840 and ends in 1975. So I'm going to go over kind of the organizational structure, and, I'll be honest, I would have liked to have a few less headings and subheadings and weave in portions of the narrative. And like I said, I did, try different ways of reorganizing the information, but this ended up being kind of the clearest way of presenting things within the time frame that we had. So we started with the historic context, which are determined by time period. Let's see. And this helped kind of contextualize the circumstances of women living in Nebraska. So we start with a kind of a brief overview of Nebraska history. And then we talk about kind of an overview of what women in the United States, throughout the United States, were doing in the building trades, particularly because the national scene of what women were doing in the building trades didn't always kind of align with what was going on in Nebraska. There were very different circumstances, but we wanted to kind of have that context as well. And then kind of honed in on Nebraska women and what they were doing in terms of shaping the built environment. And then we kind of further had some subheadings, and I'll go into these a bit more about the various different types of building trades. And then if we identified an example property type, we included one, but it was not exhaustive. So there are certainly more property types out there. So we kind of created these building trade categories as a way of thinking about the different ways that women were shaping the built environment. So we have the technical professionals, and those are the women who were doing work that required some kind of technical training, even if it was through an apprenticeship or shadowing a male family member or friends, or women who were self-taught through correspondence courses or through reading books, but kind of the more technical fields like architecture, landscape architecture, engineering, drafting. And then we had the tradeswomen, which covered those women who were engaged in kind of the more hands-on physical construction and building, carpenters, contractors, blacksmiths, etc. And then we have the planners, who are women who shape the built environment through a more big picture or high-level lens, either through urban planning or real estate development, or through advocacy in the field of historic preservation. And then the designers are those women who created and shaped the built environment from a really aesthetic or artistic lens. So visual artists, interior designers, decorators, muralists, mosaicists, that kind of thing. And then the independents. And these were the women who shaped the built environment really kind of outside of the bounds of really easily categorized fields of labor. So this includes Indigenous women who historically played a substantial role in overseeing building and dwelling construction and decoration, homesteaders who improved their land claims, built simple dwellings and planted crops, women who oversaw broad land management or agricultural properties and their development. But really, trying to capture the different ways that women worked to shape the environment. And this I'll go into a bit more, but a note on real estate developers, and this applies to some of the women, in the independence category. Not all properties associated with women realtors may be eligible for listing under the MPDF, and this was something that we, made sure to clarify in our registration requirements. For example, a property that was just bought or sold by a woman realtor, but who did not contribute to the design, construction, development, or renovation of the properties would likely not be eligible for listing under the MPDF. But a woman in the real estate industry who purchased the property and had it developed may be eligible for listing if the documentation can confirm that she made a substantial and significant contribution to the design, planning, or physical construction of the property. Now, associated property types. This one was a tricky one, and I'll talk a little bit more. But other than the select properties we identified during the research and those already associated with Laura B. Wood that we knew about from the outset, we did not conduct a statewide survey of the project, of Nebraska, of women's potential properties associated with women in the building trades. And because the MPDF is listed under Criterion A in the area of social history, all the different types of properties, they could be landscapes, they could be a work of public art, it could be a building, it could be an archaeological ruin. There's a very wide array of property types. So rather than try to imagine all the different potential property types that might be eligible under the MPDF, we tried something a little bit different. And I don't know if this strategy has been used before. There are a lot of MPDFs out there. But we decided to stick with just the general National Register property types. So buildings, sites, structures, objects, and districts. And, you know, we did get some questions about the strategy from SHPO and the State Board of Review and NPS, that there was concern that this might imply that any property constructed by a woman or women would therefore automatically be eligible under the MPDF. But in order to be listed under this or any other MPDF, a property still needs to meet the general National Register guidelines for significance and integrity that an individually listed property would. So we enhanced and reiterated that the woman or women's work needed to be significant, and I'll go into that a bit more, and retain integrity so that it can convey its significance. And ultimately, the MPDF was listed using these registration requirements. All right, so the historic contexts. I'm going to share with you some of the really cool stories about women throughout Nebraska who are shaping the built environment over time, and just reiterate, you know, because we didn't conduct a survey, you know, some of these women there might not be extant properties associated with them. But I think that their stories really show the kind of unique and different ways that women were contributing to shaping the landscape of Nebraska. So, you know, we have them organized by time period. And, you know, while we did move the period of significant start date up to 1840, we kept in some of the earlier history just to provide background on the people living in Nebraska prior to settler colonization. So, you know, we start to see the earliest records that shed light on women's contributions in Indigenous communities in Nebraska in the mid-19th century. And there are some early ethnographic and anthropological records that note that Indigenous Plains women had a substantial role in the construction and maintenance of dwellings. In many cases, women had ownership over dwellings and their home. And they were, you know, really in charge of kind of dwelling construction, dwelling decoration. So for the Ho-Chunk and Winnebago women, they were known for making birch bark lodges, which you can see at the top right of the screen. The Omaha people typically lived in earth lodge dwellings, although they also used teepees when they were on expeditions or excursions. And women could become specialists in various trades, including teepee makers and teepee decorators. And one of the really interesting things was that women's work was often compensated. So, you know, that's not something that we see, you know, later on necessarily. So, you know, coming into 1854, we have the controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act, which creates the Nebraska Territory. And we start to see, you know, these frontier towns quickly being established throughout Nebraska. In 1855, Amelia Bloomer was pushing for women's suffrage in Nebraska and addressed the territorial legislature, although ultimately unsuccessful at getting suffrage codified at that time. And then between 1854 and 1877, we start to see the forced removal or relocation of the Indigenous peoples of Nebraska. So the Omaha people were removed to a reservation along the Missouri River, while the Ponca and the Pawnee people were ultimately forced to relocate to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. So moving into the homesteading and territorial era, there's several various acts that opened up settlement in Nebraska, but the Homestead Act of 1862 really kind of opened everything up, and it allowed both women to both participate in and challenge imperial westward expansion. So women made up between 10 and 20% of the homesteading population, and that included both single and married women. And you know, one of the interesting statistics I found was that women homesteaders called proved up, which means that they successfully constructed dwellings, lived on their property, and either planted crops or trees to the point where they received the final land title. They proved up their claims at a rate of over 42%, compared with 37% of men. So during this time, there were many women, European American, Black, immigrant women, you know, all staked claims throughout Nebraska and the Midwest. Now, during the Civil War, as men were drafted into service, a lot of women stayed home and oversaw their families' large farms and ranches. They served as nurses and even filled in the industrial workforce. And so this increased role they played, you know, really paved the way for women to start asserting a bigger presence in public life. And this is kind of something that we see over and over again throughout history is, when it's wartime, women really step up and take on these roles that, previously they were told they were incapable of doing. And then after, wartime ends, women have this renewed drive to really kind of assert a larger presence in public life. So one really, interesting example of these early homesteaders in Nebraska is the Speece family, led by two formerly enslaved folks who moved to Nebraska in 1882 and filed their first homestead claim in Custer County. And many of their children, including their daughters, continued to file land claims and successfully prove them up. Now, eventually, many of the family members moved and settled claims in Wyoming. But in the early years, they were really instrumental in the foundation of one of Nebraska's earliest African-American communities near DeWitt, where other families came and settled, had land claims and settled. Let's see. Another example is the story of Carolyn Morton, who moved to Nebraska with her husband, Jay Sterling, in 1867. They started with just a small 2-frame homestead, and over time continued to expand both the residence, and you can see, the big difference in the photos here, as well as the property. Now, Carolyn's husband was often away for work, and so she took a really large role in developing the property, in developing the landscaping. She picked out all of the species of trees and plants that were planted. She planted many of them herself. She did the interior design of her home and also painted much of the artwork in the home herself. And Arbor Lodge is now listed NHL. And I think it'd be great to do a little bit more research on the specifics of her role in the development of that property. And then Esther Carter Griswold, she was a twice widowed woman who filed a claim near Roca, Nebraska in 1864. Started out with a small little lean-to shack, then moved on to a log cabin. By 1870, she built this large stone house on her claim, where she ran a farm, she raised her children, she was an outspoken proponent of women's suffrage, and she continued to farm her land until her death in 1901. See. So in the late 19th century, railroads started coming through Nebraska, bringing construction materials, they're bringing labor. They also brought, numerous new families from the East who started bringing in cultural influences, books, luxury items, and a desire for more kind of refinement in the Western frontier. And during this time, there was also several large waves of immigration into Nebraska, including African Americans from the South who were part of the Great Migration out of the Deep South, and who settled in Nebraska and filed land claims. In 1867, Nebraska became a state. The University of Nebraska was chartered in 1869 and opened in 1871. And that same year, the state legislature first passed a law allowing married women to buy and sell property independently. So here's a case, the story of Rosalie LaFlèche Farley and Alice Fletcher, which is one of those that, I'm not sure if there are properties still extant associated with them, but kind of the way that we were looking at how women were shaping the built environment in unique ways. So Rosalie LaFlèche Farley was an Indigenous woman. She was the daughter of the Omaha chief, Joseph LaFlèche. And she was really concerned with forging a path for the Omaha people, watching the Indigenous groups being, forcibly removed from Nebraska. She really wanted to kind of spare her people. And so she was looking for ways of making sure that they could, stay in Nebraska and have some agency over, what was happening with their people. So along with a white anthropologist named Alice Fletcher, they started enacting allotment procedures on the Omaha Reservation in the 1880s. And Fletcher oversaw the individual allotments on the reservation, and LaFlèche Farley, she managed the communal Omaha lands. She served as a bookkeeper and business manager for the Omaha people, and in hindsight, their efforts, ended up being a bit controversial. But I think it does really kind of illuminate the ways that women were trying to take an active role in land management and how that intersects with their communities and what was going on at the time. And so, just to note, like real estate developers, properties associated with women land managers may or may not be eligible for listing under the NPDF, unless the woman has a direct and significant role in shaping the physical landscape. But there certainly may be instances where that's appropriate. So one thing that we found really useful during our research was looking at census data. And this kind of shows an overview of how few women were formally in the building trades in the state over time. So one tricky thing about census data is that they don't always enumerate the same fields during every census, so it requires a little bit of interpretation. But this data clearly shows that women were very sparsely represented in the building trades between 1890 and 1910. With the exception of the field of artists, sculptors, and teachers of art, which is where they did outnumber men pretty consistently over time. And this is, largely due to the general perception that both fine art and teaching were considered socially acceptable fields for women during this time period. So during the early 20th century, the automobile really revolutionized life in Nebraska, particularly for women living in rural areas. It really improved connectivity, gave them more access to goods, and reduced isolation for rural women. In 1913, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln began admitting female students to their architecture courses. Although a lot of women lacked the necessary mathematics skills to fully participate, they hadn't had access to the courses. They weren't allowed to take some of the courses that they needed in order to get into the program. So that was really an initial barrier. And then during the war, women were recruited for industrial, mechanical, and agricultural work. You see over 11,000 women in the U.S. joining the Navy. And then after the Civil War, after World War I, women were really urged back into the home to make space for men in the workforce. But a lot of women, started speaking out and urging more public roles. In urban areas like Omaha and Lincoln, there was a real estate boom. As the railroads had come in, these communities were growing, and they were attracting a lot of women who had a bit of capital and wanted to make sure that they had a little bit of income that was their own. So one woman that we discovered, this was a really fun find during our research, was Allie Leet. Allie Leet started out as a teacher. And after she married, she decided to design the couple's first home in Tobin, Nebraska. And then she briefly lived in an architect-designed home in Lincoln, but sold that home and decided she wanted to design her own home at 1908 B Street, which you can see at the top of the screen here. And it was reportedly the first stucco and brick house in the city when it was completed in 1911. Allie was known for designing and drawing all of her own blueprints. She would then hire a contractor to bring them to life, but they were pretty much always completed exactly according to her blueprints. So eventually people started seeing her homes and really liking them, and they would ask for her to share her blueprints. And so these continued to be built across Lincoln. And then, kind of going back to the census data and how we need to look at that with, a critical eye, despite having designed and overseen construction of numerous buildings in Lincoln, census records do not have an occupation listed for Allie Leet. And the one kind of made newspaper article that talks about her work, it referred to her interest in design as a fad. So, this is one of the kind of many challenges that we have in trying to find these stories, is that women both weren't being recognized, but also weren't necessarily advertising the work that they were doing. So women's contributions to the war helped secure the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote in 1920. And let's see, what do I have here? A 1921 study highlighted a rise in women entering the arts, particularly as mural and stained glass artists. And during this time, we really start to see more women in Omaha and Lincoln turning to real estate as a viable way of earning money, especially at a time when these areas were facing acute housing shortages. These were kind of considered an acceptable way for women to earn an income. And so we start to see more and more women entering the real estate industry. But we also see women like Helene Mitchell-Foe, who was an interior designer, and she established her own interior design business in Lincoln in the early 1920s. She opened a storefront, which she continued to operate even after her marriage. She gave lectures on design and completed the design of the interior of the Lincoln University Club. And eventually in 1950, she was elected president of the Nebraska Art Association. Now, this example, Helen Robertson, is from South Dakota, but she was reportedly the only woman contractor in the Midwest during this time. She was the only female delegate to the South Dakota Contractors Convention out of 200 in attendance, and repeatedly attended various conventions like this and was the only woman there. She oversaw the construction of the $90,000 parochial St. Thomas Catholic School in Madison, South Dakota, after her father, who was a contractor as well, died. And continued to be a contractor throughout her life. And so I just thought that was a really cool story. So looking again at Nebraska census data, we see that between 1920 and 1930, women were still pretty sparsely represented in the trades, and we even start to see some decline in women in the trades. In some fields like builders and contractors, the number of men start to increase, and you see women stay the same at one. But there is one field that this is reversed, and we see gains, and we see the number of males in this line declining, and that is real estate. So you can see that women real estate agents increase almost double between 1920 and 1930. While men in that industry drop off pretty dramatically. And so this is I'll come back to this when we get to discussing Laura B. Wood. So one of the other great women that we came across in our research was Golda Peckman-Seti. She was an architect, had an interest in design as a young child, and said, she would rather be drawing house plans and reading books on architecture than, being out with her friends playing. And her first kind of foray into design, she started on her own home. And then it took her 7 years between designing her own home and then to start speculative building. But she ended up designing numerous revival homes throughout Omaha in the 1930s, many of which are still extant. And you can see here, I just love her homes. I think they're so charming. And another really fascinating story was the story of Meredith Tom. She was the first graduate of University of Nebraska-Lincoln, or first woman graduate, with a civil engineering degree in 1929. She also went on to get the first master's degree, first woman's master's degree in civil engineering in 1931. And she was written up about, she was one of the only woman out of 100 engineers hired to the technical force of the Tri-County headquarters in Lincoln, which was a New Deal era program that ultimately resulted in the construction of the Kingsley Dam in Lake McConaughy in Nebraska. During the 1930s, as I noted earlier, there was a big rise in women working as artists, muralists, mosaicists, and we see kind of through New Deal era programs, women actually being able to get commissions to work in public buildings. So for most mural commissions for New Deal era projects, the selection process was anonymous. And so the regional jury did not know if the applicants, were male, female, black, white, what have you. And so that was really kind of an opening for people to get their work in public spaces. So we have the sisters Jenny McGoffin and Ethel McGoffin, who were muralists originally from Colorado, but they ended up painting two murals. Ethel's was the Threshing mural in Auburn, Nebraska, completed in 1938. And Jenny McGoffin's Winter in Nebraska mural was in the Albion, Nebraska post office, completed in 1939. Katie B. Faulkner, she painted this mural called The End of the Line in the Valentine Post Office in 1939. And she was the only Native Nebraskan woman to complete a post office mural during these New Deal era programs. Elizabeth Dolan was an artist who was commissioned to paint the Spirit of the Prairie mural in the Nebraska State Capitol in Lincoln. And I really love this mural because it really centers women's roles in the history of the plains. It features a woman, an infant, and a child perched atop a hill in the prairie. And then Hildreth Mier, she was a mosaicist who was hired by the architect of the Capitol building in Lincoln, Bertram Goodhue, and he really kind of took a chance on Mier, and her mosaics are absolutely stunning. And she went on to do, really impressive work, mosaics in the Great Hall for the National Academy of Science in Washington, D.C., Radio City Music Hall in New York, and numerous other, big scale commissions. So during World War II and after World War II, because there had been a number of military installations installed in Nebraska, Nebraska became much less isolated. There was much more connectivity. We kind of see the post-war mechanization of farming, and this leads to a lot of urbanization and some significant demographic shifts in Nebraska. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, we see the rise of various civil rights movements, the passage of the Equal Pay Act, the National Organization for Women. And so more and more pushes for women to be in these roles and to be compensated equally. So Frances Shep Wilkie is one woman that we came across in our research. She was the first woman to graduate from Kansas State University with a degree in architecture. And she started out with establishing a firm with her husband and designed thousands of homes, mostly in Omaha, but some in Colorado and in other places. A lot of her homes were in the post-war minimal traditional and ranch styles, but she also did kind of full service design. So she would do both the exterior and the interior design. Another woman that we came across was Grace Harlan Kennedy, who started as an interior designer at Orchard and Wilhelm Interior Design in Omaha in the late 1940s, and continued to make a really prominent name for herself in that industry. In 1965, she was elected the regional VP of the American Institute of Interior Designers, and she had also helped form the Nebraska chapter of that organization. She was also an artist, and she exhibited at the Joslin Museum as well as the Milwaukee Art Institute and put on traveling exhibits throughout the country. So even though the period of significance of the MPDF ends in 1975, we did include some context that kind of shows the great work that women in the building trades are doing in Nebraska today. And kind of, we do start to see towards the end of the 20th century, much more growth in women working in the building trades. So real estate remained a really popular entry point for women in the building trades. As of 2024, there are no known Black women licensed as architects in the state of Nebraska, and there were only 4 licensed Black male architects in the state. Because we don't have a bunch of recent census tables that enumerate other groups, we don't have a ton of data quite yet on what other women were doing. But I did find a statistic that in 2016, women made up over 10% of Nebraskans employed in the construction industry. And so here are a few examples of some women who are working in the trades in Nebraska now. Miranda Adams and Ashley Kuhn are the founders of Blair Freeman Contracting, the first Class A contractor business run by Black women in Nebraska. And they specialize in building affordable housing and disaster recovery and residential and commercial construction. I also have Sarah Rowe, who is an artist and muralist. And she's an Indigenous artist who designs really large-scale murals that intersect with the built environment. So here's an example of a mural she did called Star Seeds that adorns grain silos at Arden Mills in South Oklahoma, or not Oklahoma, sorry, Omaha. So moving into Laura B. Wood. So the MPDF is now listed on the National Register, and we are still working through the process of getting the properties associated with Laura B. Wood listed. She was a real estate developer and builder in Lincoln in the 1920s through the 1940s. And her work is really what initiated this project. So I'm going to kind of go over some background about her and kind of where we are with that right now. So Laura B. Wood was born Laura O. McFarland in Ohio in 1874 and moved to Thayer County, Nebraska in the 1890s. In 1894, she married George Ward and had her daughter Alta Mae Ward the following year. Now, Laura's life is really kind of reflective of the difficulty of living in Nebraska during that time when it was still kind of rough and tumble and, difficult for women. She married and divorced several times. She married a saloon owner. and divorced him. And in 1912, there was a police raid on her residence claiming it was a house of ill repute. She denied all of the claims. She had boarders in her home, and this was often used as an excuse to kind of target women. We don't know the full story, but yeah. So in 1916, she married her boarder, Ray Wood, who was a traveling salesman. And then in 1922, she began a career in real estate, first just buying and selling existing properties. And then the first home she developed was her home and office at 2655 South 13th Street in Lincoln. And as you can see, it has a separate entrance for her residence and business. And then also she had boarders in her home here as well, some of whom were her employees. She had family members living here. But you can see that it was specifically designed so that she could have a special space for her office. So despite, the onset of the Great Depression and these kind of efforts to urge women back into the home and out of the workforce, Wood developed more properties in the 1930s than in the previous decade. The 1930 census listed her occupation as contractor in the industry houses, and in the city directories, she was listed both as real estate and as a builder. She designed mostly small, minimal traditional residences with very simple details. She frequently advertised the affordability of her homes, but she also built the only two modernist single-family homes in the neighborhood in Southeast Lincoln, which you can see here. So Laura B. Wood was a very prolific self-promoter. She had put out lots of ads in the newspaper, and as you can see here, she also, unlike some of the other developers in the neighborhoods that she was working in and throughout Lincoln, she did not implement racially restrictive covenants on her properties, which was becoming more and more frequent during that time. And then she also helped her clients secure FHA-backed loans and also provided interior decorating services. Laura B. Wood's daughter, Alta Mae Ward, eventually joined her mother in their business. Alta Mae also had a bit of a, rough go facing adversity from a young age. She was married at the age of 17 to a man named Edgar Kester, who was a local cabaret singer. That did not work out. So she moved back to Lincoln after citing abuse and leaving her husband. She moved back to Lincoln to live with her mother. She remarried. And then after her husband died in 1933, she moved back in with her mother and continued working for the real estate business. Now, Laura B. Wood passed away in 1942, and Alta Mae took over the business at that time. And then eventually her daughter, Halcyon Protzman Bowman, who was a musician and dancer, also joined the family business. By 1954, unfortunately, she filed for bankruptcy and died the following year at her son's home in California. So the city of Lincoln submitted a National Register nomination for the Laura B. Wood district back in 2022. And it included kind of a small concentration of resources, but noted the presence of other properties in the surrounding area that were built by Laura B. Wood or Alta Mae Ward. So when NPS returned the National Register nomination, it noted that there was no justification for excluding the other resources that were built by Wood and Ward, and that if there was going to be just a key selection of resources that were being nominated, there needed to be some kind of justification for why these were representative of Ward and Wood's work, and not the other properties. So this was a bit of a struggle because Wood and Ward's developments was really disparate, and this was likely due to a lack of capital investment that maybe some of her other male developer peers might have had access to. So her homes are kind of scattered, ad hoc throughout these neighborhoods and are not in a super concentrated area. And so this made creating a cohesive boundary for a historic district really challenging. And we definitely tried several different ways of looking at this and evaluating this. And as you can see, it's pretty scattered. So, after we submitted this, NPS did not feel that discontiguous district was warranted because there are no visual cues that distinguish Wood and Ward's properties from other developers in the neighborhood. Now, other than the two modernist buildings, a lot of their buildings were in the typical styles of the time, and from the street don't necessarily stand out from the other properties in the neighborhood. So right now we're kind of in the process of determining whether there's a cluster of small buildings that justifiably are representative of Laura B. Wood and Alta Mae Ward's work, or potentially looking at listing her home and office individually. So some of the challenges with listing the properties associated with Laura B. Wood and Alta Mae Ward, despite a lot of efforts by preservation professionals and advocates, the National Register program makes proving significance for resources associated with women's history, and particularly those with significance in the area of social history, a bit challenging. Although she's only one of very few women in Lincoln, or according to census data, maybe the only woman in Lincoln at that time successfully working as a property developer or contractor in this, at that time, very male-dominated industry. According to the way the standards of significance are written, this alone does not qualify Laura B. Wood's work as significant. So kind of combining that with the broader challenges of limited source material that cover women's contributions in the building trades, sufficiently demonstrating significance such that they meet that National Register requirements really requires some out-of-the-box thinking. Yes, Laura B. Wood was very prolific at self-promotion, but we weren't seeing, others necessarily writing about her or seeing her appear in trade journals like we might see some of her male contemporaries. But I think it's very notable that, Laura B. Wood and Alta Mae Ward ran a successful real estate and development business for over 20 years through the Great Depression. As we saw in the census data, there were over 1,600 men listed as builders and contractors in 1930, and there was only one woman in the entire state listed in the U.S. Census in that category. So some lessons learned, some takeaways. Let's see. First and foremost, I think cast a wide net in your research and outreach because you never know what you're going to find and where you're going to find it. Start kind of broad and don't limit yourself to the kinds of things that you're considering, at least at first. That might come later. Now, a lot much more time than you think for research and outreach. I will say that so much extra time was spent just finding the woman's first name, right? If she's listed by her husband's name, that we have to go to Ancestry and look that up and find that and track that down. So you're just going to need a bit more time than you would if you were writing something about, a high style building or something like that. And then one thing that would have been, let's see. So start on a small scale, especially if you're in a place where this is a really new field. Like I said, on the East Coast or in other areas like Chicago, there might be a lot more material to work with. But if you're looking at other places in the West, you might have to start on a smaller, more localized scale to really be able to kind of hone in on some of this work. If you have the time, budget, and available information, so you have already identified some women and potential resources, conducting a survey of properties associated with them that you've identified would really help inform the NPDF. At a statewide scale, this was really difficult. This kind of goes back to this: start smaller when possible. Take advantage of the census and labor statistics to kind of help fill in some of these gaps, with the caveat that they're probably going to undercount women's contributions. Women might not have stated that they were an architect if they didn't have a formal architecture license. The census data is super helpful for coming up with a baseline, but it might not give the whole picture. So Ancestry.com, super helpful for finding women's given names when they're referred to by their husband's names or initials. A lot of local libraries will, if you have a library card, give you access to Ancestry.com. If possible, identify and interview oral history narrators. Unfortunately, we didn't find anyone for this project that had a ton of information, but I think that can always really help strengthen, especially when we're in a field of study that doesn't have as much typical documentation available. We really need to get creative with search terms. So, lots of combinations of woman, contractor, builder, architect, and just have to really be creative to kind of to find some of this information. And then as you're kind of framing your narrative, consider how you and future nomination preparers will frame the significance of women's contributions to the built environment within the National Register guidelines. And then some kind of overarching takeaways on NPDFs for underrepresented populations. So there is guidance on preparing NPDFs. It's provided in NPS Bulletin 16B. But as with all nominations, there's a certain amount of subjectivity. So the perspectives on the purpose and the format and the function of NPDFs can sometimes vary between the SHPOs, Park Service, and the written guidance. So, communicate as much as possible early on to gain an understanding of the expectations of an NPDF at your local SHPO, and see, if you come up with kind of a plan, if you can get some preliminary feedback from the Park Service. So in Bulletin 16B, it states that when considering property types in an NPDF, consider the fullest extent of the significant historic values of a group of related resources. So basically include as many resources that might, or resource types that might fall under the NPDF. But for NPDFs listed under Criterion A, social history, these can be very widely. So, essentially what, I had mentioned earlier is we just use the typical National Register criteria, or property types, sorry, and to make this as broad as possible. There's still a bit of work to do in expanding our understanding of women's history and how to convey significance in the absence of typical types of source materials. And this has been particularly relevant for the Wood and Ward nomination, as I noted. If feasible, create partnerships with local women's organizations, historical societies, archivists, or other relevant groups that can help cast a wider net for source materials. People might already know about someone who's done some work. So really kind of reach out and see if you can create some connections. And then, it might be a windy road, but really it's incredibly gratifying to further highlight the initiative, the ambition, and the resilience of the women who are working outside of these socially acceptable fields and the boundaries of women's labor. So thank you so much for listening. This has been, a really great project, really work. I appreciate listening, and I really hope it leads to more studies like this in the future.
Okay, so if there are any questions, I have one question in the chat, and right now was the LaFleche woman that you talked about, was she related to Susan LaFleche?
Yes, I believe they were sisters.
Okay, all right. That's the only question I saw in there, but if any of you do have questions, you can speak now or now. Well, there was a question that we had before we got started. And we were talking about, because of the houses that are made from sod versus here in Arizona, we have houses made from adobe, is how did they protect them from the elements? I mean, adobe does not do real well with, floods, heavy rains.
Yeah, from my understanding, neither do sod houses. There were a lot of mentions of, when it rained, all the dirt would kind of pour in, and it wasn't, an ideal scenario. A lot of them would have been built into, if there was a hillside, they would have built it into a hillside for a little bit of extra protection. But sod houses were often considered kind of temporary, and that was just to kind of get you going until you could get enough materials to build something. Or sometimes they would be reinforced, so later, when you got materials, you put, wood cladding around your sod house to further insulate it. But yeah, I think, some of the kind of really more humble sod houses probably weren't great in the rain.
Right. Are there any other questions? We still have a lot of people here. You can unmute yourself and even show yourself. I found this to be really fascinating, but no questions. Oh my gosh. Checking.
No, but this is Margaret Hagan. I will make a comment. I think your list of lessons learned was really good, and I think that not only applies to women's history but other history that is less documented. So that was really helpful to see that.
Yeah. One of the things that I find, because I'm doing, I don't, it's not really an MPDF, but it strikes me as odd, shall we say, but that you didn't find some master's thesis or, you know, doctoral work done at least on women's history in Nebraska.
There are some works on women's history more broadly, and we did review those. A lot of early women doctors, women lawyers, that kind of thing. But women specifically working the building trades, we did not find. Now, sure, there might be more source materials out there. Like I said, we had 6 months, so there's always potential that there could be more out there. And there is some good background on women's history generally, but not on the specifics of women working the building trades.
Well, this certainly might pique the interest of some future history student or women's studies.
Mm-hmm. Well, we would love that.
That's interested in that. I just know I just picked up a master's thesis on a project that I'm working on, and I'm like, whoa, this has got a lot of good stuff. Not everything that I need, but it's still quite interesting. So, yes. Any other questions?
Yeah,
JJ, you were asking questions before, so you have anything more?
Yeah, this is Jadine. I just want to make a comment. I'm originally from Nebraska, and I've been working on the history of my hometown, which is Ravenna, Nebraska. And I've been researching it now for probably close to 10 years. And I was primarily interested on the business history of Ravenna, but it's extended to all these small, like ABC towns, they call them, along the railroad. But it extends to the creamery and the mills, and basically the same thing that all these little towns had back in the day. But I'm actually working with our historical society right now on a calendar for next year that's just devoted to women in businesses and their impact on Ravenna. And what I found, I read the local newspaper now from 1886 up through 1929, and most of the women's inputs or their influence on Ravenna has been through basically taking on businesses once their husbands passed away, like especially with the mercantiles and such. And these women ran the businesses successfully for 20 years plus. And then also the same, women were generally involved in the millinery businesses where they were, designing hats and such, and then floral shops and such. And then the other item that I found too is successful women that took over these farms after their husbands passed away or some injury happened, and they continued to not only operate their farm but ran kind of businesses where they sold their crops and also purchased additional land and moved on. So it's been really interesting looking at women specifically in business. That's the reason I'd signed up today, is also identifying their struggle to operate or run a business because they had limited means because of financial limitations and then not having the say with voting. So in looking at women's relationships with the current political, the abilities that they had to allow them to, in essence, begin a business. They were relegated to teaching and kind of some of those more common occupations that you would associate women with. But and then also too, in thinking about the land ownership, when a farm was sold, even though the lady, they were married, it was always the gentleman's name that was associated. There was no Mr. and Mrs. It was Mr. John, Brown's farm. So it's been interesting in looking at the total influence of women, like I said, through 30, 40 years and how it's evolved. I just wanted to put that out there. So I enjoyed your presentation today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great hearing that you're doing that research. And I think you bring up, something that we came across a lot, whereas a lot of women who were doing some of this work, it wasn't, for some women, it was out of, pure interest. But a lot of times it was out of necessity, right? Their husband died and they had to manage the farm, or they had to, support themselves financially after their husband died, or there were very few kind of guardrails for women out there at the time. So I think that really just kind of highlights that women were looking for whatever ways they could to kind of, especially during the early years, just kind of survive, and that meant taking on a lot of different roles.
Any other questions?
I will ask one. This is Andrea Mock, and I wonder, because we're doing the same thing here, we have a grant from the National Trust, and we're working through the LA Conservancy and through the University of Southern California to add women back into our already landmarked buildings. And what I found when I was working with one is that you really had to be careful about what you were reading because most of it was written by men. And so you kind of had to decipher the truth from what was written. Did you tend to run into that a lot?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the times the newspaper articles we would read would, like I said about, I think it was Allie Leet, they called her interest in design a fad. It was something she did for fun. But I mean, she was drawing blueprints. She was working as an architect. She was having her homes built. So there's a lot of kind of minimization of women's work that we saw a lot. And then you could also kind of get a sense of women being wary of talking too much about what they were doing because they didn't want to attract negative attention. And so, saying, oh, it's just a hobby that I do this and this. And then you find out they actually have a storefront and they're, so they're doing a lot more than they're kind of saying that they're doing. Yeah, I think that, and then also interpreting the census data. And there's a lot of extra layers of research to really kind of dig down to what's going on, which is why it just is much more time consuming to really kind of get to the bottom of things and kind of compare, what you're reading here to what's actually going on in whatever state or region or town. There's a lot of kind of back and forth comparisons you need to do to make sure that the materials you're reading, that you're understanding the bias inherent within those materials.
Any other questions? Well, I guess then we can say goodbye, but just remember, we have recorded this and that when we post it on the Arizona Preservation YouTube channel, we will let you know in case you want to review it again, and that there are other postings up there that will might pique your interest. Our next one is going to be Tuesday, August 5th. Andrea Mock is the presenter. Andrea, you want to give a little blurb?
Certainly. So I have been doing a lot of work with things that have already been lost and how we can remember them through using very simple technology that we have, things that most people can do without having to go back to school and, study a lot to use the technology. But it makes it very interesting. And so I'll be presenting several instances of where that's been done.
So that link will be sent out probably tomorrow. I'll be posting it on various social media sites. And if you're interested, again, it will be free. It will be starting at 10 o'clock in the morning. And thank you one and all oh, wait a second. It's in the chat. If you want to go to the chat, the registration link is hot. Hasn't even been posted on our social media sites. And we hope you can join us again. So thanks again to Rebecca for all she had to share with us. I think it's given us a lot to think about, especially for any of us who have had to work on MPDFs. Yes, in a short period of time.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Goodbye.